I never expected my boss to humiliate me in front of everyone at dinner. And I certainly never expected what happened next. The memory of that evening is burned into me, so sharp that I can still taste the metallic bitterness in my mouth when I think of it. It had been billed as a celebration, our company's quarterly dinner, the kind of event where the executives showed off their suits, where deals were whispered over glasses of wine, and where people like me were expected to smile, nod, and stay invisible. I was not invisible that night. I remember standing in front of the mirror before leaving my apartment, my hands smoothing over the dress that had once belonged to my mother. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't designer, it wasn't the kind of thing most women in that room would have chosen. But to me, it was everything. A deep navy shade, modest but elegant, with embroidery at the neckline my mother had stitched by hand. She had worn it to her first job interview in America decades earlier, and every time I put it on, I felt a piece of her strength settle onto my shoulders. Still, as the car pulled up to the hotel where the dinner was being held, I felt small. I had rehearsed my smile, my polite responses, my careful steps. My company was led by men who lived in tailored suits, women who draped themselves in luxury brands, people who treated this kind of dinner like a runway. And there I was, clutching my small clutch bag, praying nobody would notice me. The ballroom shimmered with golden light, the kind that makes crystal glasses sparkle and hides no flaw. Laughter echoed across the tables, waiters glided with silver trays, and chandeliers hung heavy with wealth. I found my seat toward the end of the table, hoping to disappear among the chatter, and for a while I did. My boss, Richard, arrived late, as always. He swept in with the air of a man who believed the entire room had been waiting just for him. He was tall, sharp-jawed, with eyes that scanned the room like he was measuring everyone's worth in dollars. When he reached the head of the table, conversations hushed, and he lifted his glass in a toast. His voice boomed with authority, practiced, like a man used to being admired. But admiration wasn't enough for him. Richard loved control, and he loved target. Out of his mouth told me I hadn't. The table turned toward me, eyes flickering down to my dress. Some polite, some curious, some eager to see blood. Richard let the silence hang, savoring it, before he delivered the blow. "It's quaint, isn't it?" he chuckled. "Almost like something out of a thrift store. Reminds me of my grandmother's curtains." Laughter erupted, not all at once, but enough. A few people forced it out, nervous, desperate not to be the next target. Others chuckled genuinely, amused at his cruelty. Heat crawled up my neck, my chest. I wanted to shrink, to fold into myself, to disappear under the table. I could feel every eye on me, burning holes into my skin, stripping me bare. My hand brushed over the embroidery on my neckline, the place where my mother's fingers had once lingered. To me, it was strength. To them, it was weakness. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. My tongue felt heavy, like cement. My chest tightened. My face burned with humiliation. Richard leaned forward, clearly enjoying the sight of me unraveling. "But hey," he said smoothly, raising his glass as though in some cruel toast, "at least she's authentic." He winked, and another wave of laughter followed. The walls of the ballroom closed in. I could hear the clinking of glasses, the scraping of forks, the low murmurs of pity that were worse than the laughter. In that moment, I wasn't a colleague. I wasn't a professional. I wasn't even a human being. I was a punchline. And the worst part? I stayed silent. I told myself to speak, to defend myself, to remind them that the dress wasn't just a dress. It was my mother's courage stitched into fabric. It was proof of how far I had come. But the words stuck. My throat burned, my eyes blurred, and I sat there, mute, as my boss used me for entertainment. This is the part I hate admitting. For a moment, I believed him. I believed that maybe I didn't belong at that table, that maybe the dress did make me look small, out of place, laughable. It's terrifying how quickly humiliation can turn into self-doubt, how fast someone's cruelty can become your own inner voice. I wanted to run. I wanted to vanish. But I stayed, paralyzed, swallowing my up, confused. A man at the far end of the table pushed back his chair and rose to his feet. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't smirking. His face was hard, unreadable, and his eyes weren't on anyone else. They were on Richard. The room stilled. Even Richard's smirk faltered, his glass hovering in his hand. My heart pounded in my chest as the man's voice cut through the silence, calm but firm. But then, just as my boss smirked, a stranger pushed back his chair and stood up. Nobody interrupts a CEO at his own dinner, yet that's exactly what happened. For a split second I thought I had imagined it, the scrape of the chair, the sharpness of the gesture, but no, it was real. The man at the far end of the table had risen to his feet, his napkin falling silently to the floor, his gaze fixed not on his wineglass or his plate, but on Richard. The air shifted immediately, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room, and all eyes followed the movement with a ripple of disbelief. It was one thing for Richard to mock me. That was his sport, his habit. Nobody ever challenged him for it. But for someone to stand against him in his own arena, in front of his hand-picked audience, was something else entirely. I didn't know the man's name then. All I knew was that he carried himself with an authority that didn't need to be announced. He was older than Richard by maybe a decade, his shoulders straight, his presence commanding without being loud. His suit was simple, not the flamboyant custom tailoring Richard favoured, but it fit like armour. His eyes were steady, sharp, the kind that seemed to notice everything and miss nothing. Later I would learn his name, Daniel Hayes, a professional appraiser known in high circles for his uncompromising honesty and expertise. But in that moment, all I saw was a stranger willing to break a silence nobody else dared disturb. Gasps moved down the table like a wave. Forks paused in midair. Wineglasses hovered, forgotten. Richard's smirk froze on his face as he registered what was happening. The room, once filled with chatter and clinking silverware, fell into an almost sacred hush. Daniel's voice was calm, measured, but it carried across the table with ease. "Richard," he said. And the way he spoke his name, firm, unbending, believe what I was hearing. Nobody ever spoke to Richard that way. He was the CEO. He was the man who signed paychecks, who decided careers with the flick of a pen. He was untouchable, or at least I had thought so. Richard's laugh faltered, thinner now, edged with irritation. "Are you really going to lecture me, Daniel, at my table?" Daniel's jaw set. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now but no less commanding. "This isn't your table, Richard. Respect doesn't belong to you just because you paid for the dinner. Respect is earned, and tonight you've shown none." A ripple moved through the guests. I saw eyes widen, mouths part slightly in shock. A woman across from me set her fork down with a clink, as though she didn't trust her hand to stay steady. Someone coughed nervously. I sat frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. For the first time all evening, the spotlight shifted off me. But instead of relief, I felt a flood of disbelief, confusion, and something else I hadn't expected. Gratitude. No one had ever stood up for me against Richard before. No one. Richard's face darkened, the smirk gone now, replaced by a tightening jaw and a glint of anger in his eyes. "You're overstepping, Daniel," he said, his tone sharp as broken glass. But Daniel didn't waver. "No, you crossed a line, and someone needed to say it." It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Calm, controlled. The way a man speaks when he knows he has nothing to fear. It wasn't defiance for the sake of rebellion. It was conviction. For the first time, I saw Richard hesitate. His fingers tightened on the stem of his wineglass, and he leaned back, feigning indifference, though the stiffness in his posture betrayed him. I couldn't look away. Part of me wanted to sink into the shadows and stay invisible. But another part, a part I hadn't felt in years, rose up inside me like a spark. Someone saw me. Someone called out what Richard had done. Someone dared to break the silence that had always suffocated me. The room seemed to lean toward Daniel, waiting, hungry, electrified by the audacity of his words. I could feel the shift in energy, the way people who had been laughing a moment ago now sat rigid, caught between fear of Richard and awe. He know anything about my dress? I felt myself shrinking under the weight of their stares again, but Daniel's eyes softened when they met mine, a flicker of reassurance in their steadiness. He wasn't mocking me. He wasn't pitying me. He was protecting me. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white, my mind spun in circles, desperate to understand. What could he possibly know about my mother's dress? About the hours she had spent stitching it? About the life she had built piece by piece in a country that never made it easy? Daniel straightened, his gaze sweeping the table, landing finally on Richard again. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that pressed down on everyone in the room. And then he revealed something about my dress that left the entire table speechless. What my boss mocked was hiding a story even I hadn't told anyone yet. For a heartbeat, silence filled the room so completely that I could hear the faint hum of the chandelier above us, the soft clink of silverware settling back onto plates. Everyone's eyes were on Daniel. His words had cracked open the moment, shifted it from mockery to something heavier, something charged. He hadn't just called out my boss's cruelty, he was pointing to something deeper, something that even I had kept tucked away in the quietest corners of myself. Richard leaned back, crossing his arms with a forced smirk, as if he were daring Daniel to explain himself. But his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. For a man who thrived on controlling the room, the possibility that he had underestimated me, even in something as small as a dress, was a threat. Daniel didn't look at Richard. Not yet. His gaze was steady on me. That's not a cheap dress. His voice carrying across the table, calm but resonant. That's craftsmanship. It's history. And it deserves respect. A murmur rippled among the guests. The tone of the room shifted, curiosity cutting through the tension. Some leaned forward, studying the embroidery they had ignored before. Others glanced at me with a new expression, not mockery, but a hesitant kind of admiration. I felt my throat tighten. My fingers brushed the neckline where my mother's stitches rested, delicate but strong. My whole body, hands raw from needles and fabric. She had saved every dollar to put me through school. She had poured her dreams into me when she had no time left for her own. And this dress, this modest, carefully stitched dress, was the last gift she had left me before cancer took her. Nobody here knew that. I had never spoken it aloud. In a world obsessed with labels and price tags, I had kept my mother's story hidden, as though it might expose me as too ordinary, too unpolished for their world. But now, with Daniel's words lingering in the air, I felt the weight of my silence. I drew a shaky breath. My mother made this dress, I said quietly, my voice unsteady but carrying just enough for the nearest guests to hear. Their heads turned sharply, attention snapping back to me. She stitched every thread herself. She wore it to her first job interview after she immigrated. She believed it carried her courage, and when she died, she left it for me. The words poured out, trembling but unstoppable, like a dam breaking. The table was silent. Not the mocking silence from before, but something different, heavy, respectful. For the first time since the night began, I felt taller in my chair, though my hands still shook. My heart pounded, my throat burned, but I didn't shrink. I let them see it, the truth, the grief, the love. Daniel nodded slightly, like he had known it all along. That's what I meant, he said, his voice steady. That's not a dress you mock. That's a legacy you honor. I could almost hear the shift, like the room exhaled at once. Sympathy flickered in the eyes around me. Even the ones who had laughed earlier now seemed uncomfortable, their gazes darting away, ashamed. Richard's smirk faltered, his jaw tightening. He wasn't used to losing control of the room. He wasn't used to his cruelty being reframed into his own weakness. And he wasn't about to let it end there. Touching, he said, his voice slick with sarcasm. A sweet little sob story. But this is business, not a charity gala. Courage doesn't close deals. Sentiment doesn't get you promoted. You want to climb in this world, you wear the right clothes, play the right game, and stop clinging to fairy tales. His words hit me like a punch. The sympathy in the room trembled. Wasn't finished. But instead of apologizing, my boss leaned forward and said something that made me tremble. Just when I thought he'd back down, he twisted the knife deeper. For a fleeting second, after I revealed the truth about my mother's dress, I thought maybe Richard would soften. Maybe he would recognize the weight of what had been said, the shift in the room, the silent judgment in the eyes around him. I thought perhaps, for once, he would step away from cruelty and let the evening recover some dignity. But I should have known better. Richard never yielded. To him, admitting fault was weakness, and weakness was blood in the water. Instead of pulling back, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the pristine white tablecloth, his gaze pinning me like a hawk circling prey. His smile was slow, deliberate, the kind that promised another strike. "Well," he said, his voice oily with false charm, "that explains a lot." The guests shifted in their seats, uneasy. They could feel what was coming, and still nobody stopped him. Richard's eyes flicked over my dress again before meeting mine. "You see, this is the problem. You can't drag your past into a room like this and expect to belong. This is a table for people who've earned their place, who understand what success looks like. And success doesn't look like hand-me-downs from queens." The words sliced through me. He said queens like it was dirt under his shoe, like the burrow that had raised me was nothing but a stain. My stomach dropped. Anger flared hot in my chest, but fear gripped tighter. I could feel every insecurity I had buried clawing its way to the surface. The whispers I had silenced for years, "You don't belong here, you're not one of them, you'll never measure up," came roaring back with every syllable he spat. I clenched my fists under the table, nails biting into my palms. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to throw the glass of wine in his smug face, to finally let him see that I wasn't weak. But another part, the part that had survived in rooms like this by keeping my head down, froze me in place. What if I fought back and lost everything? What if this moment, this single evening, destroyed the career I had built piece by piece? Richard tilted his head, studying me with mock curiosity. "Tell me," he said, his voice carrying easily across her. Richard's eyes snapped toward him, a flicker of rage flashing. "And what's that supposed to mean?" Daniel didn't flinch. "It means real success isn't measured in fabric labels or zip codes. It's measured in resilience, in dignity, something you clearly don't recognize." The tension at the table thickened, almost suffocating. Some guests avoided eye contact entirely, while others looked between the two men like spectators at a boxing match. I sat caught in the middle, my pulse hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. Daniel's defense should have made me feel safe, but instead it churned something uneasy inside me. Because even as his words soothed part of me, they also stirred questions I wasn't ready to face. Why was he defending me so strongly? Why risk crossing Richard, a man notorious for crushing rivals, just to protect me? Gratitude battled suspicion in my chest. Richard, however, wasn't backing down. He gave a sharp laugh, bitterness coating the sound. "Spare me the sermon. This isn't about dignity. It's about reality. And the reality is," he gestured towards me with his glass, "people like her will always be on the outside looking in. She might be smart, hard-working, even lucky enough to sit at this table for now, but she's not one of us, and deep down, she knows it." His words landed with brutal precision, hitting the exact nerve I tried so hard to keep hidden. He was right about one thing. Deep down, I did doubt myself. Nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was an imposter. If the successes I had achieved were just borrowed time before someone realized I didn't belong. And now, he had dragged that private fear into the open, weaponized it in front of everyone. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. I hated him for it, but I hated myself more for the flicker of truth in his cruelty. Daniel's gaze softened when it landed on me, his expression steady, almost protective. He wasn't just fighting Richard anymore. He was giving me something I had never had in this world: validation. His words weren't just shields, they were seeds, planting a vision of justice, of a moment where Richard might finally be exposed for the fraud he was. But even as hope stirred, fear else could see. The realization hit me with a jolt that made my heart skip. And that's when I realized the appraiser wasn't just defending me. He had his own hidden agenda. The stranger who defended me wasn't just a guest. He had a secret connection to my boss. The realization crept over me slowly, like shadows lengthening across a room. At first, I thought Daniel had spoken up out of simple decency, a man unwilling to watch cruelty go unchecked. But as the words between him and Richard sharpened, as the air grew heavier with unspoken history, I began to sense something deeper pulsing beneath the surface. Richard's reaction wasn't just irritation, it was personal. His eyes narrowed at Daniel in a way I had never seen before, not even toward his most stubborn competitors. And Daniel, for all his calm, wasn't neutral. His voice carried a sharp edge of familiarity, the kind that comes only from wounds long made and never forgotten. I felt like I had been thrust into a duel already years in the making, my humiliation merely the spark that lit the fire. The dinner table, once a stage for polite toasts and shallow compliments, had transformed into an arena. Conversations died out entirely now. Forks lay untouched on plates. The only sounds were the faint clink of ice in glasses and the brittle laugh of someone trying to mask their nerves. I sat rigid in my chair, trying to piece together what I was seeing. Daniel wasn't just here by chance. This wasn't the first time he had stood across from Richard, and now I was caught between them. My mind spun back to stories I had overheard in passing at the office, mentions of a prominent appraiser who had once blocked one of Richard's acquisitions, whispers of a deal gone sour, a man who refused to bend to Richard's relentless ambition. Could this be him? Daniel finally turned his eyes from me and locked them on Richard, his gaze sharp, unyielding. "It's funny," he said, his tone even, "how little changes. You sit at a table, surround yourself with sycophants, and still believe you're untouchable." Richard's jaw tightened, his glass set down with a sharp clink. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" he muttered, low enough that only those nearest could hear, but the venom in his voice every word. "This isn't your stage, Daniel. Don't come into my house and play savior. You think standing up for her makes you noble? You're just looking for another excuse to stick your nose in where it doesn't belong." His words sent a shiver through me. I wanted to speak, to reclaim my story, but my voice was caught in the storm between them. I wasn't sure if I was the firewood or the flame. Daniel didn't flinch. He lifted his glass slowly, deliberately, and set it back down without drinking. "It's not about her," he said, though his eyes flickered briefly toward me with something softer. "It's about you. It always has been. You build your empire on humiliation, intimidation, deceit. But what you don't understand, Richard, is that foundations like that eventually crack." The words hung heavy, louder than any outburst could have been. Around us, the guests were no longer just diners, they were spectators. Their whispers grew louder, but never enough to drown out the exchange. Some looked thrilled, hungry for the spectacle. Others seemed frightened, darting nervous glances toward Richard, as if his wrath might spill over onto anyone too visibly entertained. I sat there, trembling, torn between awe and terror. This wasn't about me anymore. I had become the battlefield, but the war was theirs, and that terrified me more than anything, because when men like Richard fought, the collateral damage was never just the furniture. It was the people caught in their orbit, people like me. Richard gave a harsh, bitter laugh, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "You always did think you were better than me, didn't you? Standing there with your smug little lectures, pretending your morals make you strong. But look at you, still circling my table, still watching me, still trying to tear me down because you couldn't beat me before." Before. The word hit me like a thunderclap. There it was, the proof. There had been a before. This wasn't their first collision. This was a rematch, a continuation of a fight I had just stumbled into. Daniel's calm cracked for the briefest moment. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened. "No," he said quietly, but with conviction. "I didn't beat you before because you lied. You twisted numbers, buried truths, bought silence. But lies don't stay buried forever." The murmurs grew to belief, and I, sitting in the center of it all, realized something that made my breath hitch. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I had become a symbol. My humiliation, my silence, my story. It was the spark that revealed the cracks in his armor. Richard's face was stone, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted, calculating, assessing who was swayed, who was watching too closely, who might whisper tomorrow what they had heard tonight. Daniel straightened in his chair, his calm returning like armor slipping back into place. He let the silence stretch, let Richard stew in it. Then, with a voice quiet but razor sharp, he spoke words that sent a chill racing through me. And then the appraiser said something that could destroy my boss's entire reputation. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Daniel hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. His tone was steady, even, almost conversational, but the weight of what he said pressed down on the room like a storm about to break. He named what Richard had always kept hidden: the unethical practices, the buried scandals, the truths whispered only behind closed doors. It was like watching a crack split across a sheet of glass. At first, you think it's small, containable, but then it branches, spreading, until the whole thing is ready to shatter. Gasps rippled across the table, heads turned. Eyes darted nervously toward Richard, searching his face for confirmation, denial, anything. Silverware lay abandoned on plates. Wine glasses trembled in unsteady hands. The room was no longer just a dinner. It was a courtroom. Richard's reaction was swift, practiced. He let out a booming laugh, the kind that demanded others join in, the kind he used to command control. "Unethical practices?" he repeated, shaking his head with exaggerated amusement. "Really, Daniel? This again? I thought you'd grown out of your obsession with me." Some guests chuckled weakly, but the sound was hollow, brittle. Their laughter didn't ring with loyalty. It rang with fear. I sat frozen, every muscle taut, my heart pounding in my chest. My humiliation from earlier still burned hot inside me. But now it was layered with something else. The possibility that Richard might finally be seen for who he really was.
That's all you've ever had, Daniel.
Empty words. And people here know better than to trust a man who's been jealous of me for years. The word jealous hung in the air, an attempt to reframe Daniel's defiance as envy. But I saw the way the guests exchanged glances, hesitant, uncertain. The seed of doubt had already been planted, and no amount of laughter could pull it out. I felt torn in two. On one side was fear of what would happen if Daniel pushed too far, fear of Richard's wrath spilling over onto me for being the spark that started this fire. On the other side was something unfamiliar but intoxicating. Hope. The hope that Richard's cruelty, his arrogance, his unchecked power might finally meet a wall he couldn't climb. The tension at the table thickened. Conversations didn't resume. Forks didn't move. Every eye was locked on the invisible battle being fought in plain sight. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping but somehow carrying even stronger. Jealousy? Hardly. What I've always had is integrity, something you've never understood. The words struck like a hammer. For the first time, I saw Richard falter. Just for a heartbeat, his mask slipped, and I caught a flash of the man beneath. The fear, the rage, the desperate calculation of someone realizing the walls might be closing in. The guests sensed it too. I saw it in the subtle shifts, the way a woman across the table slowly set down her glass, the way two men exchanged quick glances, the way shoulders straightened, as if they no longer needed to hunch beneath Richard's dominance. It was subtle, but it was real. The tide was turning. And in that shift, something shifted inside me, too. For so long, I had lived under Richard's shadow, shrinking in the face of his power, swallowing my pride, telling myself that silence was survival. But watching Daniel stand against him, watching the guests' doubt grow, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Strength. My humiliation wasn't the end of me. It was the beginning of his unraveling. Still, fear gnawed at me. Richard wasn't a man who gave up easily. He would fight back, claw for control, and if he couldn't reclaim it through charm, he would use destruction. He leaned the shift of power, the crumbling of certainty. Richard wasn't untouchable anymore. Daniel sat back slowly, his composure unshaken, his eyes never leaving Richard's. The truth has a way of surfacing, Richard, no matter how deep you bury it. Tonight was just the beginning. The room held its breath, the weight of his words pressed down like stone, undeniable and unshakable. And though I wanted to believe it was the end, that justice had finally arrived, I knew better. Richard's pride was too great, his cruelty too practiced. He wouldn't let the night end like this, with him cornered and exposed. He would find a way to claw back control, and I had no doubt he would use me to do it. My heart sank as his eyes flickered back to me, a glint of malice sparking in their depths. But my boss wasn't done humiliating me. He had one more weapon up his sleeve. I didn't see the betrayal coming, from someone I thought was my ally. The shift in the room after Daniel's accusation was like the current changing beneath a swimmer who doesn't notice until the tide has already carried her off course. At first I felt the tentative warmth of relief, a fragile belief that the night might be tilting away from humiliation towards something that resembled justice. The guests had grown wary of Richard's swagger. A few had even allowed sympathy to slip across their features when they looked at me, as if they were finally willing to see a person instead of a prop in his theater of power. Yet the moment stretched too long, and in that stretch I felt the familiar cold of Richard's attention turning back to me, searching for a lever, some pressure point he could still exploit to retake the room. His eyes drifted down the table, pausing on faces he had paid in favors, faces he had kept compliant through raises and introductions and reminders that everyone at this level owed him something. When his gaze landed on Ava, I understood, too late, what his last weapon would be. Ava and I had been hired in the same cohort 3 years earlier. We had survived the same impossible deadlines, traded draft decks at midnight, and split cab rides home after meetings that should never have been scheduled in the first place. She was the first person to congratulate me when I'd been invited to this dinner. The text she sent that morning still glowed on my phone if I dared look down. "You earned this."
Weight of his displeasure and the possibility of his favor. When he finally spoke, it was not with the booming bravado he had used to belittle me, but with the velvet tone he reserved for suggestions that sounded like choices but were really commands. He tilted his head toward Ava and asked a question so casual it felt like a hook concealed in silk. "You've always had a good eye, Ava. Be honest. Am I wrong about the optics here?" The table turned toward her in the same way it had turned toward me, curious, hungry, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Ava glanced down at her plate, then up at me, and for a fleeting heartbeat I thought I saw apology gather in her eyes like rain. But it never fell. She straightened, rolled her shoulders as if shrugging off the residue of old loyalty, and offered a smile that was practiced enough to pass as empathy. When she spoke, her voice was steady, almost gentle, the softness making the blade more lethal. "It's not that you're wrong, Richard. It's that this environment is demanding, and perception matters. We all have to adapt to the room we're in. If we don't, we risk sending signals we don't intend." The words floated out with the neutral polish of corporate caution, but I heard the message inside them clearly. She doesn't belong here. It was dressed in professional language, draped in polite caveats, but stripped of its costume, it was the same judgment Richard had flung with a smirk. It landed with a thud in my chest. Around the table, I felt the sympathy I had begun to trust wobble, as if people were relieved to be granted permission to doubt me again. A few nods, one thoughtful frown, the soft murmurs that meant perhaps the CEO had a point after all. The room, like so many rooms before it, was yearning to drift back toward the comfort of his authority, and Ava had tossed it a rope. Daniel's chair creaked lightly as he shifted. His eyes settled on Ava, not angry, but disappointed in a way that was somehow worse. He set his palms on the table, not to strike, but to steady the ground before it sloped out from under me. "Perception can be manipulated," he said, his tone even, "and it is very often manipulated by those who benefit most from keeping others in their place. We should be careful not to call oppression optics." A ripple of discomfort ran along the table. Guests nodded again, more confidently this time, as if her language had offered them a safe lane to return to, one where no one had to admit that what happened earlier had been humiliation, where nobody had to evaluate the rot Daniel had named, where the problem could become my ignorance of the dress codes instead of Richard's contempt. I felt the ground tilt beneath me, nausea rising, the room blurring at the edges. Ava kept speaking, stringing phrases that seemed designed to comfort the powerful while appearing compassionate to those watching. I admire the story behind the dress, she continued, and she looked at me as she said it, gifting me a smile so considerate it burned. I truly do. But there's a time and place for sentiment, and there's a time and place for strategy. Tonight is strategy. Daniel drew a slow breath, as though weighing which words would keep me from shattering while still pushing back the tide that was forming. Strategy without integrity is just surrender dressed up as wisdom, he said. Richard humiliated her. We all saw it. We can either acknowledge what that was or hide behind euphemisms. Richard laughed softly, relieved that the narrative had been wrestled back into a frame he could manage. He set his glass down with a controlled tap and spread his hands in a gesture of magnanimity he hadn't earned. No one is hiding anything. Ava's right. We're talking about standards. The world has them. Successful people learn them. It's not cruel to say that. It's honest. And believe it or not, honesty is compassion in this business. The room relaxed by a fraction. There was the man they recognized again. Not a bully, but a steward of standards. Not a tyrant, but a teacher of tough truths. Ava turned to me as if she were offering a hand. I've always had your back, she said. You know that. I want you to win here. I want you to have the career you deserve. But that means understanding how rooms like this work. We can't rewrite the rules in one night. It is a particular kind of loneliness to hear betrayal spoken in the language of care. I stared at her and wondered how many nights she had rehearsed this tone, how many times she had chosen proximity to power and told herself it was for the sake of mentoring women like me. I wanted to say her name and ask her why she had texted me pride that morning if she planned to do this by evening. I wanted to say that my mother's dress moderate, like a system, rebooting after a brief outage. I looked down at the embroidery at my neckline and tried to steady my breathing. Shame pressed against my ribs, because Ava's performance had made it so much easier for the room to believe that my injury was my lesson to absorb. Daniel did not allow the reboot to finish. He waited until the chuckles faded and then spoke with an almost judicial calm. "Let me be precise," he said, and heads turned toward him again because his precision had already started a different kind of electricity in the room. "We are not discussing a faux pas. We are discussing the choice of a CEO to single out a subordinate's appearance in a public setting to assert dominance. That was not a standard. That was a tactic. And it worked, because too many of you confuse cruelty with competence." The sentence sliced the air so cleanly that I could feel the room flinch. Richard's face hardened. Ava's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened around her napkin. She glanced at Richard, and I watched a glance transmit a paragraph. "I tried. The rest is yours." He nodded almost imperceptibly. It was a handoff disguised as deference. For a few minutes, the dinner splintered into murmurs, people in pairs recalibrating their positions, hunting for safe opinions to borrow. I sat inside the hum and felt my heartbreak finally reach the surface. I had thought I understood the rules. Work twice as hard and keep your head down. Find the women who know the shortcuts and hold on to them. Turn private grief into private strength and occupy your seat without asking for applause. But the rules were not written in effort, or sisterhood, or quiet resilience. They were written in a language I had not wanted to speak. A language that asked women like Ava to translate power for men like Richard, and then call the translation mentorship. I felt the tears gather, hot and humiliating. I set my palms flat on the table to keep from shaking. Daniel's voice reached me, low enough to feel like a hand on my shoulder. "Breathe," he said, without looking directly at me. A single word widened into a lifeline. I drew in air, slow and shallow, and tried to stitch myself back together. Yet, the more I fought for composure, like glass. My throat closed, the air thin and bright, the chandeliers too sharp against my eyes.
I tried to conjure my mother's voice the way I always did when panic threatened, but even that memory flickered. The room itself felt like a verdict. "Enough," Daniel said, not loudly, but in a way that carried, and there was a collective stillness because even those who resented him had learned to listen. "We are not going to pretend that what happened earlier was a pedagogical moment. We are not going to corral this into a conversation about dress codes." Richard crossed a line. "And the only reason this room wants to talk about culture is because it is easier than admitting you laughed when a powerful man took pleasure in humiliating a woman who works for him." Silence followed, thick and startling, because the sentence rearranged the table's moral furniture. A woman 2 seats down inhaled sharply. The partner who had joked about his watch looked at his hands. Ava's face tightened with something that might have been regret if she had allowed it more room. Richard stared at Daniel with a hatred that wasn't concealed by etiquette anymore. The stillness gave me a window, and into that window rushed every contradictory feeling clawing for space inside me. Grief for what Ava had just done, gratitude for Daniel's spine, fury at the room's eagerness to be taught the lesson that hurt me, terror at what Richard would do if he felt the balance shifting again. I tried to hold them all at once and failed, and the failure opened a small sound in my throat that I couldn't swallow. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of sound a person makes when the lid of endurance finally lifts. I reached for my water and missed the glass by an inch, and the fork beside it rattled against the plate in a noise that felt louder than it was. Heads turned. I felt every eye return to me, not with mockery this time, but with that terrible curiosity that attends a witness about to break. Daniel turned his face slightly, not enough to put me on display, enough to let me know he noticed and to offer cover if I needed it. "Do you need a moment?" he asked. And the question was more than courtesy. It was permission, something no one had ever handed me at a table like this. I nodded once, unable to. Had been an internship in the rituals of proximity, that my confidences had been study material for nights like this. I swallowed, tasted metal, and looked away from her. The room waited. The chandelier hummed. Somewhere, a phone vibrated against a purse, the small private thunder that felt indecent in the middle of a public unmaking. I tried to remain silent, to hold the line of composure and let the storm pass over me the way I had been trained to do. But something inside had shifted, something permanent and dangerous and necessary. The narrative that had always controlled me, be grateful, be adaptable, be invisible unless they need you visible, felt suddenly like a costume I could no longer wear without suffocating. My hands trembled, and I placed them in my lap to hide it, but the tremor moved to my voice anyway. "I hear you," I managed, each syllable grinding across the grit in my throat. "And I'm trying to hear you with generosity. But what I keep hearing is that the only way to belong here is to disappear first." A beat passed. Another. The room did not know how to metabolize a sentence like that. Daniel's face turned toward me fully now, and in his eyes I saw a steadiness that wasn't pity. Richard's expression shifted. There was triumph there, because he could make anything a prelude to his control. But there was also calculation, the rapid kind that meant he had not yet decided whether to punish me or recruit me into some narrative that absolved him. Ava's mouth opened and shut, the first sign of uncertainty she'd shown all evening. I realized I was crying only when the salt touched the corner of my lips. I wiped at my face quickly, ashamed of the evidence, furious at the shame. The room's sympathy returned in fits, unreliable and complicated by their investment in the myth that this place made people by breaking them. Daniel spoke my name softly, once, like a hand placed on a shoulder without pressing. I wanted to end the night right there, to stand up and walk out and never again allow a room like this to teach me what I was worth. But the thing about humiliation is that it makes you crave not just escape, but reversal. I wanted the story to turn. I wanted the people who had laughed to taste what they had offered me. I wanted to name something truer than when I revealed the secret I had carried for years. The words tumbled from my lips before I even knew I had decided to speak. They were raw, unpolished, too unguarded for a room like this, but once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. My chest heaved, my throat tight, as though every memory I had fought to bury was clawing its way out at once. I didn't grow up with wealth, I said, my voice catching on the edges of the truth. I wasn't groomed for this kind of room. My mother worked 12-hour shifts in a sewing shop, and my father drove a delivery truck until the day his back gave out. We lived paycheck to paycheck, and some weeks those paychecks weren't enough. I wore hand-me-downs until they fell apart. I studied under streetlights when our power was cut off. Nothing about me was destined to end up at this table. Nothing except work. The silence thickened, different now, less predatory, more stunned. Forks stilled, conversations froze. Even the soft background music seemed to fade into the wallpaper. I drew another shaky breath, my hands trembling in my lap. Everything I have, I fought for. Every scholarship, every late night, every chance I was given, I clawed my way toward it. My mother never had time for dreams of her own, so she poured them into me instead. And this dress, my fingers brushed the embroidery, the stitches my mother had laid down with hands worn from labor, is the only piece of her I have left. She believed in me enough to stitch her hope into fabric. So if it looks out of place at this table, maybe it's because I was never supposed to be here in the first place. But I am here, and I'm not ashamed of it. My words cracked open the room like a thunderclap. Some guests blinked, startled, as though they had just been reminded that beneath their polished surfaces lay stories they had never dared to tell. A woman near the center dabbed her eyes with her napkin. A man on the far side shifted uncomfortably, guilt flickering across his features as if he suddenly remembered the laughter he had joined in earlier. For a brief moment, I thought I saw understanding, empathy, a recalibration of the way they
than ever. Still, doubt churned in my chest. Had I gone too far? Had I just confirmed every suspicion they had about me? That I was an outsider, pretending, an intruder who had stumbled into a world that wasn't built for me. My heart ached with the weight of it. And then Daniel spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of quiet conviction that makes people lean in. "That's not baggage," he said, his gaze steady on me, then shifting deliberately to the others. "That's grit. That's the kind of story that built this country, the kind of strength that can't be bought or borrowed. You think you're better because you can purchase power, Richard. Try living a life where you had to earn every step. That's strength. That's leadership." The shift in the room was unmistakable this time. Heads nodded, subtle but real. A murmur of agreement threaded through the table. Guests who had once clung to Richard's dominance were now listening to Daniel, not just hearing him but resonating with the truth in his words. Richard's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. He reached for his glass again, hiding behind the motion, but I saw the muscle twitch in his jaw. He wasn't used to losing ground, and he didn't like it. I sat stunned, my confession hanging between us all, transformed by Daniel's words into something I had never believed it could be, a strength instead of a weakness. For so long I had carried my past like a secret shame, terrified it would make me seem small in rooms like this. But now, watching the way the guests looked at me, some with admiration, others with discomfort born of recognition, I felt something stir inside me. For the first time that night, I wasn't shrinking. I was standing taller, even as I sat, frozen in my chair. My mother's voice whispered in the back of my mind, reminding me that worth was never written in bank accounts or designer labels. It was stitched, thread by thread, in the resilience to keep going when the world tried to stop you. Richard shifted again, forcing a laugh that didn't quite mask his frustration. "Don't let him romanticize you," he said, pointing his glass toward me. "This is business, not a charity."
I refused to give up until I earned one. The silence that followed was different, charged, almost reverent. Even those who didn't agree with me seemed to respect the fire in my words. I felt it in the way their eyes softened, in the way the tension in the air shifted ever so slightly in my favor. Richard's face darkened. He opened his mouth to retort, but Daniel spoke first, his voice cutting through like a blade. And then the appraiser turned to me and said words that would change my life forever. He wasn't just defending me, he was offering me a way out. The words Daniel spoke after my confession landed with a weight I hadn't expected. They weren't just a rebuttal to Richard's cruelty or an attempt to soothe my shame. They were something more. He turned toward me, his voice steady but carrying a current that felt like it was meant for me alone. "You don't belong at this table because you conformed to it," he said. "You belong because you have what most people here will never understand. Resilience, conviction, authenticity. That is what real leadership looks like. And if you ever get tired of being diminished instead of recognized, I know places where your value wouldn't just be tolerated, it would be celebrated." The room went still again, but this time for a different reason. My chest tightened, heat rising to my face as his words sank in. He wasn't just defending me, he was offering me something, a chance, a way out of Richard's shadow. Richard's chair creaked sharply as he leaned forward, his smirk gone, replaced with something darker. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, and his hand gripped his wineglass so tightly I thought the stem might snap. "Careful, Daniel," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "That sounds a lot like poaching." Daniel didn't flinch. "It sounds like recognizing talent where it's being wasted." The words sliced clean, and I felt the shock ripple down the table. Gasps, whispers, the sound of silverware nervously shifting against porcelain. Guests glanced between the two men, torn between fascination and fear, as though they were watching two predators circle over the same prey. And that prey was me. My heart thundered in my chest. For years I had fought for scraps of approval in Richard's world, convincing myself that if I worked harder, stayed quieter, proved myself just a little more, I'd finally belong. And now, in unrelenting, his pride was wounded, his control slipping, and I could see in his eyes that he wasn't just angry at Daniel. He was furious with me for being the reason Daniel had spoken those words. I wanted to breathe in the offer, to let it fill the emptiness inside me that years of silence and humiliation had carved out. I wanted to imagine a future where I didn't spend every day bracing for the next cutting remark, the next dismissal, the next battle to prove I deserved to be in the room. But another voice whispered in my ear, the voice of fear, fear of retaliation, fear of losing everything I had built, fear of Richard's wrath if I even let the possibility show on my face. Daniel's eyes softened as they met mine, steady, reassuring. He wasn't pressuring me. He wasn't dangling it like bait. He was simply laying the truth on the table, that I had a choice. For the first time, I realized that my future didn't have to be tethered to Richard's approval. For the first time, I realized that my loyalty to him had been nothing but a leash I had mistaken for security. The air in the room vibrated with tension, every guest waiting to see what I would say, which path I would choose. But before I could even part my lips, before I could take a single breath to form an answer, Richard's hand slammed down on the table with a crack so loud it made the wineglasses rattle. Every head jerked toward him. His face was a mask of fury, his eyes wild with a desperate kind of rage that no smirk could disguise. And before I could answer, my boss slammed his hand on the table and revealed something shocking. His words weren't just humiliating, they were dangerous. The crack of Richard's hand against the table silenced the entire room. Glasses rattled, forks froze in midair, and every conversation died instantly. He leaned forward, his eyes blazing, his voice sharp and low enough to feel like it was directed at me alone, though everyone heard it. "You so much as consider his offer," he hissed, nodding toward Daniel, "and I will make sure you never work in this industry again." The words slammed into me harder than his hand had hit the table. My breath caught,
my chest tightening as fear spread like fire through my...
He knew my job wasn't just a job. It was my lifeline. The difference between stability and collapse. He had always dangled power over me in subtle ways, but this was different. This was a knife pressed against my future. My mind spiraled. What if he followed through? What if one word from him blacklisted me across the industry? People believed Richard. He had connections everywhere. He could make a call and have me erased before I even sent out another resume. The thought hollowed me out. I wanted to protest, to tell him he was bluffing, but deep down I knew he wasn't. He was the kind of man who destroyed people simply to prove he could. And here I was, trembling at the edge of that destruction. Daniel's expression hardened, his jaw tightened, and for the first time that night, he looked ready to stand, to escalate beyond words. But he didn't, yet. He knew the moment wasn't his to answer. It was mine. Richard leaned closer, his voice quieter now, intimate in its cruelty. Don't mistake his flattery for a future. He'll move on to the next cause when he's bored. I'm the one who holds your career. Cross me, and you'll regret it. The words cut deeper than any mockery he had ever thrown at me. They sliced into the part of me that had always lived in fear. Fear of losing the little I had fought for. Fear of being cast back into the life my mother had worked so hard to lift me out of. That fear had shaped me, controlled me, silenced me in rooms like this one. And now, Richard was weaponizing it in front of everyone. The guests could see it. They could see me shrinking under the weight of his threat, my hands trembling against my lap, my shoulders tight with the effort not to collapse. The shame was unbearable, not just for what he had said, but for how much of it felt true. For years I had believed survival meant silence, that fear was the price of belonging, that if I swallowed enough humiliation, if I endured enough condescension, eventually the reward would outweigh the pain. But in that moment, with his threat hanging over me like a noose, something inside me cracked. Maybe fear wasn't protecting me. Maybe it had only ever been caging me, sharp enough to draw blood. I've built people's careers and I've ended them. Which side of that equation do you want to be on? The table held its breath, waiting for my answer. My mind spun, torn between the instinct to stay silent and the desire to finally break free. And just as I opened my mouth, just as the decision began to form, a voice rose from further down the table, calm, steady, unexpected. Every head turned. And just when I thought I'd have to choose, an unexpected ally joined the fight. One by one, the others at the table began to turn against him. The voice that cut through the tension didn't belong to Daniel this time. It came from farther down the table, quiet but steady, spoken by a man who usually stayed on the periphery of Richard's spotlight. His words weren't sharp, not even confrontational. They were measured, cautious, but the effect was seismic. "Richard, maybe you went too far tonight," he said softly. The room stilled again, not with fear this time, but with something else, curiosity. Heads turned toward him, some in shock, some in relief. The simple act of someone other than Daniel breaking the silence cracked the armor Richard had wrapped himself in. Richard barked a short laugh, dismissive. "Too far? Come on. We were all having a little fun." His tone carried the false ease of a man desperate to reframe the moment, to coax the room back into his orbit. But the man didn't retreat. He shifted in his chair, meeting Richard's gaze squarely. "I didn't see anyone laughing but you." The words landed like a dart. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying what they hadn't wanted to admit. They had laughed because they were supposed to, not because they found it funny. I sat frozen, watching the shift unfold before me. It was subtle at first, like the ripple before a wave, but I felt it. Courage spreading, fragile but real. A woman near the center of the table set her fork down and leaned forward. "He's right," she said, her voice low but firm. "It was cruel. And frankly, I'm embarrassed I went along with it." Richard's eyes snapped to her, disbelief flashing across his face. For years, no one had dared to contradict him in public.
And now, one by one, voices were rising. The murmurs grew. Another guessed the truth too sharp to ignore. Richard's facade cracked. His smile, once effortless, now looked forced, strained at the edges. His hand twitched on his glass, his knuckles white. He tried to speak over them, to cut the descent off, but the momentum was against him. Another guest, older, someone Richard had always treated as an ally, cleared his throat. "I've respected you for years, Richard," he said, "but respect is earned in how you treat people, not in how much money you make. Tonight, you lost some of mine." The words landed like a hammer blow. Richard's face darkened, his jaw clenching, his charm evaporating under the weight of public disapproval. I felt my pulse race, adrenaline flooding me. For the first time all night, I wasn't shrinking into the shadows. I was watching light pierce through them. The power dynamic was shifting, slowly but unmistakably, and I was right there in the center of it. Richard looked around the table, his eyes desperate, searching for allies. But the faces that once lit up with approval now looked away. Some avoided his gaze entirely, unwilling to risk being tied to his sinking ship. And then I saw it, the flicker of panic behind his eyes. The man who had humiliated me so effortlessly was unraveling, his empire of intimidation collapsing one voice at a time. The silence that followed wasn't his to control anymore. It belonged to the room, to the guests who had finally found their voices, to the truth that could no longer be buried. And just as Richard opened his mouth to lash back, to claw at the remnants of his control, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. Everyone turned. The most powerful guest at the table, the one whose opinion carried more weight than anyone else's, stood up slowly, his presence commanding the room. And then, the most powerful guest at the table stood up to deliver the final blow. What he revealed would end my boss's reign forever. The room was already trembling with the courage that had spread around the table, but when the most powerful guest stood, silence fell like a curtain. It wasn't Daniel this time, and it wasn't one of the hesitant allies who had spoken before. It was Mr. Whitmore, the man who had funded half the ventures Richard bragged about, a titan whose word could crown or crush paper, the kind that looked unremarkable but carried the weight of dynamite. He set it on the table in front of him and smoothed it flat with deliberate care. "I wasn't going to bring this tonight," his voice steady, "but after watching the way you treated her," his eyes flicked toward me, steady and unwavering, "I realized silence only serves you, and I won't be complicit anymore." Richard's face drained of color, his composure cracking. "What is this?" he demanded, though his voice shook slightly. Whitmore didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to. "Proof. Documents tracing your last acquisition. The numbers you claimed, the valuations you swore by. They don't match reality. I've had them audited. You've built your empire on lies, Richard, and tonight, everyone here will know it." A collective gasp swept the table. Some guests leaned forward, others leaned back, but no one looked away. It was the kind of revelation that could topple careers, reputations, entire companies. I stared, my breath caught in my throat. For so long, Richard had seemed invincible, his arrogance unshakable. But now, here he was, cornered with undeniable evidence laid bare before the very people whose admiration he had thrived on. Richard tried to laugh, but it came out brittle, broken. "Fabrications," he snapped. "You've always envied me, Whitmore. This is just another attempt to undermine me." But even his allies didn't nod this time. Their silence was louder than agreement. They were calculating, recalibrating, already distancing themselves. Whitmore tapped the paper once, his eyes never leaving Richard's. "Numbers don't envy you. Numbers don't lie." The weight of the statement sank into the room. Richard's empire, built on intimidation and charm, was collapsing in real time. I could see it in the faces around me, people shifting, whispering, realizing the man they had feared was no longer untouchable. For the first time all night, I felt something like justice. My humiliation, my silence, my story. It had cracked open the door. But this was the blow that would shatter it wide. And yet, beneath the relief, Fear coiled in my chest. Because Richard wasn't the kind of man to go down quietly. His struck Richard like a blade, slicing through the armor he had worn for years. The documents Whitmore revealed were undeniable. The whispers in the room proof enough that his empire of intimidation was crumbling. But instead of folding, instead of retreating with even a shred of dignity, Richard did what men like him always did when the walls began to close in. He lashed out, and he chose me as his target. His eyes locked on mine, sharp and wild, no longer masked by charm or arrogance. "You think you're some kind of victim?" he spat, his voice louder now, cutting through the hum of shocked murmurs. "Don't fool yourself. You wouldn't even be here if it weren't for me. Every success you've had, every door you've walked through, I allowed it. I made you. And if you think you can turn this room against me, remember one thing. I can unmake you just as quickly." His words struck hard, scraping at the deepest insecurity I had carried for years, the voice I had silenced inside myself for so long, the one that whispered I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong, that I was only here because someone else had allowed me, rose to the surface. My chest tightened, my hands trembled under the table, and, for a moment, I felt the shame swallow me whole again. Gasps echoed from around the room, but no one interrupted him. They wanted to see how I would respond. They wanted to see if I would crumble or rise. Richard leaned forward, relentless. "Let's be honest. You're nothing more than a charity case in a borrowed dress, clinging to your mother's sob story because you don't have anything else to stand on. You think grit is going to carry you? Grit doesn't close deals. Grit doesn't win influence. You are nothing here without me. Nothing." The words cut deep, sharper than any insult he had thrown at me before. They pierced the very foundation of who I believed I was, leaving me exposed in front of everyone. My throat burned, my vision blurred, and for a terrifying second, I almost believed him. Then, through the fog of humiliation, I heard Daniel's voice. It wasn't loud, it wasn't commanding, it was steady, grounding, a lifeline thrown across the chasm I felt myself slipping into. "Look at me," he said firmly. My eyes flicked to his, and in them, I didn't see pity.
Snap. Not into pieces, but into place. I stood. My chair scraped against the polished floor, the sound loud, defiant. The room hushed, every eye turning toward me. My voice shook at first, but I forced it out, louder, stronger. "You didn't make me. My mother did. Every long night, every sacrifice, every stitch in this dress, she made me. And I carried her strength into every challenge I faced, every opportunity I fought for. You want to believe you built me because it makes you feel powerful, but the truth is, I was never yours to control." Gasps rippled through the room. Some faces registered shock, others admiration, but all of them listened. I turned fully to Richard, my voice no longer trembling. "You think grit doesn't matter? Grit is the only reason I'm here. It's the reason I didn't break when you tried to humiliate me. It's the reason your threats won't work anymore. You may hold titles, you may hold money, but you will never hold me again." The silence that followed was electric, thick with disbelief and awe. For the first time all night, the words filling the air were mine, not Richard's, not Daniel's, mine. And they echoed across the room with a power I hadn't known I carried. Richard's face twisted, his mouth opening to retort, but something flickered in his eyes that froze me in place. For the first time since I had met him, since I had endured his taunts and his threats, I saw something that didn't fit the mask of arrogance he wore so tightly. I saw fear, and as my words echoed through the hall, I saw something in his eyes I never expected. Fear. The man who once mocked me was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Richard had built his identity on control of the room, control of the narrative, control of people like me who had spent years shrinking under the weight of his authority. But after my words cut through the silence, after the truth rang out in a voice he could no longer silence, the cracks in his armor widened into chasms. His face flushed red, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might break. He opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out. The smirk he had worn like a second skin was gone, replaced with a grimace that revealed just how much he was unraveling. His composure, The thing that had always made him untouchable was gone. The room saw it.
All fools if you think otherwise. The outburst backfired instantly. Gasps filled the air, followed by a heavy, damning silence. His words didn't sound powerful anymore. They sounded desperate, ugly, small. Whitmore shook his head, his voice cool and final. "You've lost the room, Richard." And he had. I could feel it in the way people's eyes shifted away from him, in the way their gazes landed on me instead. Not with pity anymore, but with recognition, respect. I sat taller, the weight of fear lifting from my shoulders, replaced by something steadier. My humiliation hadn't destroyed me. It had revealed him. And in that revelation, I had become something I had never expected to be. The moral victor. Daniel turned toward me, his expression steady, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "You see? You were never powerless. You just needed to stop giving him your silence." The words hit me like a revelation. All those years I had believed fear was my shield, that silence was survival, when in truth, it had only been my cage. Tonight, I had broken it. Richard sagged back in his chair, his fury burning out into exhaustion. His empire wasn't gone in that moment, not yet. But socially, in that room, it was ashes. Every ally he had counted on had abandoned him. Every weapon he had wielded had turned to dust in his hands. And still, the eyes of the room weren't just on him. They were on me. I felt it like a weight and a gift at once. I had been the target, the scapegoat, the punchline, but now, I was the one they listened to. I was the one who had stood in the storm and spoken the truth. Daniel's voice reached me again, steady, affirming. "You've already won more than you know. This is your moment. Don't forget it." His words sealed something inside me. My mother's voice echoed in the back of my mind, reminding me of every sacrifice, every late-night study session, every step she had taken so I could stand here tonight. For the first time in years, I felt like I was honoring her. Not by surviving in silence, but by speaking in strength. Richard's collapse wasn't just his ending. It was my transformation. But as the room quieted, as his fall settled into finality, I felt another weight pressing. Collapse? I knew silence wasn't enough. If I walked away now, the story would remain unfinished. He would claw his way back somehow, rebuild his mask, and someone else would sit in this chair one day, enduring what I had endured. I couldn't let that happen. Not anymore. I rose to my feet, my palms flat against the table. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't fear this time. It was clarity. My voice carried steady, stronger than I had ever heard it. Richard built his career on intimidation, on lies, on making people small so he could seem larger. Tonight, you've all seen it for yourselves. But what you may not know is that this isn't new. I've lived it every day working under him. Every success I've had, he tried to claim as his own. Every mistake, he made mine. And when he could no longer control me quietly, he humiliated me publicly. The words echoed across the table, undeniable, raw. I didn't look at Richard, I looked at them. The people who had once applauded his cruelty, who now had to decide if they would keep pretending. He told me I was nothing without him, I continued, my voice rising. But look at him now. Stripped of his allies, his secrets exposed, his power gone. And here I stand, not broken, not destroyed, but stronger than I have ever been. Because the truth doesn't need permission. It only needs courage. Gasps turned to nods. Whispers turned to murmurs of agreement. The tide had shifted completely, not just against him, but toward me. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Well said," he murmured, just loud enough for others to hear. Daniel's eyes never left mine, pride flickering there, not pride for himself, but for me, for the fact that I had finally spoken the words I had been too afraid to claim. Richard tried one last time, his voice hoarse, desperate. "She's lying. But the words died in his throat. No one listened. His empire of fear had evaporated. One by one, the guests pushed back their chairs, not with the polite grace of a dinner ending, but with the deliberate motion of people choosing sides.
and none of them chose him. They moved toward Whitmore, toward Daniel, toward one another, leaving Richard isolated in his
anymore. They were tears of release, of gratitude, of something new, freedom. I thought of my mother, of her hands guiding the needle through fabric, of the strength she had sewn into every stitch of my dress. I thought of how she had dreamed of a life for me beyond survival. Tonight, I had stepped into that. The night didn't just end Richard's reign. It began my freedom. And now, as I stand before you, I'll leave you with this. When someone tries to silence you, will you let them? Or will you finally stand tall? If this story moved you, drop your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done at that table? Don't forget to like the video if you believe courage beats cruelty, and subscribe to join a fearless community that stands tall against injustice. Share this with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and hit the bell so you never miss the next powerful story.